Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Vasquez. I'm an Azure specialist with Microsoft Corporation. I focus on state and local government customers. And today we're going to be covering disaster recovery as a service, or DRaaS for short, another fancy acronym by Microsoft. Specifically, though, we'll be covering Azure Site Recovery, or ASR for short, which is our DR tool, so you can fail over to the cloud. We'll start off with a couple slides, and then from there I'll have a live working demo, which I can show you. Let's go ahead and so why discuss disaster recovery in the cloud? So I mean, we've all seen the natural disasters that have been taking place. We saw Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma in Puerto Rico. Um, if you don't have a good DR strategy, it's very easy for your organization to, lose access to your critical applications, especially if you have like maybe emergency responders using a specific app, as first responders to help the public. Something like that, you definitely want to have like a DR plan for. We all have our mission critical apps, and we want to make sure they're protected. And the beauty of the cloud is that it automatically provides you geo redundancy, right? You can select like a data center within Azure somewhere else within the United States or even a different country, if you'd like. So yeah, definitely a great time to start thinking about your DR strategy, especially with all the natural disasters that have been taking place. You can see here we've had data center power outages, which knock out data centers, so folks lose access to their apps, to their data. More natural disasters, you see the tornadoes in Alabama. So yeah, definitely want to consider having a good DR plan. Now, why consider the cloud for your DR strategy? Well, first of all, the cloud offers speed. I mean, you can deploy resources in Azure in minutes, right? You can do it over your browser, through PowerShell, through command line interface, but you don't have to wait for hardware to be shipped. You don't have to wait to sign a lease agreement with a colo. I mean, you simply leverage your cloud resources instantaneously. So it's super fast. So speed. Next, scalability. We have a lot of customers running out of capacity in their data centers, physical capacity. Maybe you're running out of, space on your VMware hosts. So, like your server virtualization might not be able to keep up with your demand. Security, that's huge. Microsoft spends more on security than most organizations can afford to. I mean, we're the most attacked organization outside of the DoD, so we have to have great security. And that's something that we pass on to our customers when they use our cloud services. And then the economics. I mean, you simply pay for what you use. Like, for instance, with Azure Site Recovery, which we'll be covering today, you don't actually pay for your virtual machines to run in the cloud until they're actually running. And they're not going to be running until you actually fail over to the cloud. So if your apps never fail, then what you're paying is kept to a minimum. Instead of having to buy maybe a secondary site, buy additional hardware, buy additional staff to come up with a DR plan. It's very cost effective to look at the cloud for your disaster recovery needs. So we're up to 42 Azure regions across the world. You can see we recently launched a couple data centers down in Australia, down in South Africa, and even for our public sector customers here. We had two existing regions for Azure Government, which is an isolated environment for our government customers, which meets different compliance standards like CJIS, IRS 1075, FedRAMP High. You can see we had US Gov Iowa and US Gov Virginia. So those were two government data centers that we had. And we recently launched US Gov Arizona and US Gov Texas. So for all you folks out in the West, we have data centers closer to you, which of course will help with latency. And then we have two Department of Defense regions as well. Here's a picture of one of our data centers. This is the data center in Virginia. Now, just so you understand how big those data centers are, if you look on the bottom right, where that circle is, that is an 18-wheeler. Okay, so how many of those do you think we could fit in the data center up top of the screen there? You can see we have older and newer data center technology there, different generations of data center. We have what we call IT packs there on the right, which are more modular, which uses a lot more of our newer data center technology, and the traditional data center there on the left. One thing to understand about our data centers, though, is you can see there's physical security, there's fences, there's walls, cameras, guards. Most of the staff on site are actually security staff, right? Because most of the actual Azure environment can be managed remotely with software-defined networking, with our service fabric and containers. All of that is software-defined, which makes it easier to manage remotely. But yeah, they're extremely large, 100% carbon neutral. We return every watt that we release. We use chillerless cooling in our data centers. So yeah, I mean, it's like pretty environmentally friendly if you compare it to most data centers around the world. And to show you how fast we're expanding, that's a 250-acre expansion site. Now, if you look to the top of the screen, you can see the picture we were just looking at, and this site is much larger. So you see the kind of investment that Microsoft is making in terms of Azure and our data centers. And that's something that we're providing to our customers as a service in the form of Azure. Okay, now in terms of compliance, you heard me talk about this earlier. Take a look at the second row here. You can see, let me go back. Since I deal a lot with state and local government, we have a FedRAMP High, NIST, FIPS 140-2, CGIS, IRS 1075. A lot of our competitors can't really compete with us when it comes to our compliance. So, this is something that really does set our cloud apart. And if you have any more questions around compliance, you can just do a Bing search for Microsoft Trust Center. You'll find a lot of great information there, or just reach out to your Microsoft representative. You've probably seen it in the media. Microsoft has improved their relationship with open source. We heart Linux. You've probably seen that. You can install SQL Server on Linux, which you never would have thought of, a few years ago. But now Azure fully supports Linux. Red Hat is a major partner. We actually provide support for Red Hat, direct support for Linux on Azure. So you can see some of the open source technologies here which work on Azure, which is great. I personally think this is wonderful that we're embracing open source. Okay, so today we wanted to focus on disaster recovery. So let's get to it. Azure Recovery Services. So Azure Recovery Services comprises of two main components, Azure Site Recovery, or ASR, which is what we'll cover today, and then also Azure Backup. So Azure Backup is more of like comparable to like your traditional backup providers like Commvault and NetBackup or Veritas, but it's Microsoft's own version. But today we're going to focus more on ASR. Here are some key definitions to know about so that if you hear me spewing out acronyms, you know what I'm talking about during the demo. RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective. That basically stands for the amount of time you can be down during a disaster, like how long it'll take you before you need to get your services back up. That's RTO. Now, RPO, Recovery Point Objective, is how much data loss you can have. Okay, so you can see here for RTO, for instance, for Recovery Time Objective, you can have your app backup within minutes, so the RTO is low. But for Azure Backup, the RTO is higher. It will take hours or days, because that's where if you simply want to do a point-in-time restore of a file from like 2 weeks ago, right? You wouldn't use a DR tool for that. It's not as mission critical, so you could leverage like a backup tool and just do like a restore from backup. RPO, same kind of thing. So for Azure Site Recovery, the amount of data you'll lose will either be 0 or 30 seconds. Right? So you might only lose like 30 seconds worth of data depending on what you're recovering. But compare that to having to wait days or weeks before you can spin up your application after a disaster. Microsoft Azure Site Recovery gives you the ability to do it within seconds, if not instantaneously. High availability. Think of SQL's always on or clustering, where if you lose one node, the other node will pick up the slack. So that's HA. And Azure Site Recovery is not really a high availability solution because it does require a click or some configuration to do an automatic failover. So it's not like a redundant solution where you lose a node and it keeps on running. It does require like intervention by someone, which you'll see during the demonstration. Archival, that's basically archiving backups so that you can restore them in a later point in time. That doesn't really apply for Azure Site Recovery. That's more for Azure Backup, as well as third-party backup providers like Commvault or Veeam or Veritas that leverage Azure Storage as their archival storage place. And then hybrid storage, so think of Store Simple, which is like an actual hardware appliance with disks that has SSDs where you can save your working set data on-prem on the Store Simple device, but it uses tiering. It has an algorithm which takes infrequently used data and automatically stores that up in the cloud so that you can free up your on-prem storage. So that's hybrid storage. Okay, so some key points about ASR before we jump into our demo. So basically what ASR does, it replicates your application or your servers over to the cloud. Right? That's pretty much what it does. So if you lose your application on-prem, you click a button and it fails it over to Azure so you can continue running that application or that server in Azure. The replication is near synchronous. You can use ASR for both Windows and Linux. If you're using Hyper-V as your virtualization, server virtualization hypervisor, then you'll have an RPO of 30 seconds. So you might have 30 seconds of data loss. However, if you're using VMware or you're protecting a physical server or you're doing Azure to Azure, then it's just continuous. You're not going to have any data loss because it's always running. Anytime the bits change on your hard drive, it's going to update the bits in the cloud because it's always storing like a copy of that hard drive in Azure. Azure Site Recovery is application aware, so you could be running applications like SQL Always On, like Oracle Data Guard, and even data in memory can be stored in Azure Site Recovery. Now, the snapshots for these kinds of applications that have data in memory use up a lot of space because they're rather large. So they do require a little more planning, but you can back up applications, and ASR is application aware. So multi-tiered apps definitely can be backed up with Azure. You can do test failovers. So if you want to go ahead and do a test failover of an application, it will not impact your production environment on-prem. So that's what we're going to do today. You're going to see that in action. You can also do planned failovers for testing and business continuity and DR planning if you want to. You can set up recovery plans for multi-tiered apps. So if you have something like SharePoint, where you have a web front end, an app tier, and a database tier, you can use a recovery plan to have it boot in a specific order, like maybe have your SQL servers boot first, automate the creation of a load balancer as well. So it'll automate all of that for you and get your multi-tiered app up and running in the cloud in the event of a disaster. And then lastly, you can reverse replicate, which means you can take your environment that was failed over to Azure and fail it back on premises. So once you've resolved all your issues on-prem, or once you get your data center back, you can go ahead and take your app from the cloud, put it back on-prem. The catch is you cannot fail back to physical. So if you went from physical to Azure, you'll have to go from Azure back to either VMware VM or Hyper-V VM. So you have to go back to a virtual environment on premises. I'm going to skip over the architecture for Hyper-V and VMM and jump over to VMware or physical. This is the most common scenario. We have a lot of customers that are using VMware or just want to use ASR for a physical environment. So let me see here. Let me grab my mouse and show you how this works. Okay, so right here you can see this is your on-premises data center right here. You will need to set up what we call an ASR config server, which is this box right here. So you set this up either as a VM or as a physical server in your on-prem environment. This is what will do the orchestration. It'll take whatever you're protecting, whatever servers you're protecting, and take their hard drive, or it could be a VMDK file from VMware. It'll take that and convert it to a VHD. And what it does is it takes that VHD and stores it up in Azure in this recovery services vault here. So the VHD is up in Azure because that's the format that Azure VMs use for virtual hard drives or virtual hard disks. So it's stored there. Once you actually do a failover, like when you click failover, let's say we lose this web server here. This is one that's being protected, this website. Let's say we completely lose it. It's offline. Our website is down. But what happened is you click failover in the Azure portal, and the VHD, the latest copy of the VHD is already stored here. So even if you lost that, you have a snapshot from, it could be a minute ago, whatever you set in your policy. And once you click failover, what happens is Azure starts spinning up a virtual machine. Okay, it creates a virtual machine within Azure, and once that VM is created, it takes about maybe 10 minutes. It'll attach itself to the VHD that was stored for that protected server. And you can see here is that VM. So the VM is spun up, it attaches the virtual hard drive, and it's up and running. And you have your web server up and running up in Azure. And again, the time it takes is usually about 10 minutes, which is the amount of time it takes to create a virtual machine in Azure. And if your on-prem client still needed to be able to access that server, like say if it were like maybe an intranet server over an internal network, you could create like a site-to-site VPN connection between your virtual network up in Azure and your network on premises to maintain that network connectivity. So there are options to configure it so that it appears as if it's still on your internal network, if indeed it is. So kind of in a nutshell, that's the process for Azure Site Recovery when it comes to a VMware environment or a physical environment. And then in preview, there's Azure to Azure Site Recovery. So if you do have resources already in Azure, you do have the ability to fail them over to a different Azure region, which is great because if you're building apps in Azure and one of our sites goes down, I don't think that would happen, but you never know, right? You can fail over to another Azure region. Okay, so let's show you an actual demo now. So let me go ahead and switch my screen here. Let me bring up my browser. I need to sign back into my Azure portal here. Give me one sec. All right, here's our Azure portal here. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is browse to our on-premises web server. So I went ahead and stood up a web server on-prem. It's actually in Azure, but we'll just mimic an on-prem environment. So let me go ahead and open a new window here. Let's go ahead and browse to that web server. Okay, so the IP address of that web server is 13.72.186.80. And I probably typed that in wrong. Okay, let's try that again. Make sure I have the right IP address. Here's my web server here, and the public IP. Okay, great. So that's correct. Let's try that again. So 13.72.186.80. Maybe it's still booting up. Let's try and browse to it. And there we go. It just needed to wake up. My bad. Okay, so here's my web server that I'm protecting with Azure Site Recovery. This is an on-premises web server. I'm going to go ahead and bring it down. So let's do that. All right, IA Web 01, this is my on-prem web server here, really in Azure, but just pretend for me, please. Okay, let's stop that. And let's grab this IP address. and we're going to try plugging it back in once the server is down on a new browser. Okay, it looks like my web server is down. Let's test it to make sure. So I'll open up a new browser here. And typing in that exact same IP address to make sure that my web server is down, and it's down. Can't get to the web page. And to prove that I'm not a liar, let's try it in a different browser. Same IP address. And it's thinking. Let's see if it fails. It's funny, I'm wishing for it to fail. How often do you wish for that? Yeah, it's failing. Can't get to it. It's unresponsive. So my website is down. At this point, normally people would panic. You call IT and say, "Oh my God, our data center exploded and it's gone." Right? Does that mean our website is down? I need to get to it. There's critical information. Right? You probably get calls like that from your end users. So how do we bring the web server back up in Azure? Well, let's go to our Azure portal. I'm going to do this in Azure Government today. This is where my environment is. You go to your Recovery Services Vault. Okay, this is where your Azure Site Recovery Vault is stored. How you get access to your environment up in Azure and how you set it all up. Okay, so here we're going to go to under Protected Items. Right here, Protected Items. Click on Replicated Items, and you can see here my web server is down. Right? However, the status is protected. So I do have backups or snapshots of that VM. So now I want to go ahead and do a failover. I want to bring my web server back up in Azure so that it's running. Let's go ahead and click Test Failover. I don't want to do a production failover just because this is a demo, but I'll click Test Failover here. You can choose your recovery point. So my latest recovery point is as of 2:40 p.m. today. I'm going to select that. And here I select my Azure virtual network. So I need a network to fail over to in Azure so that I can actually communicate with my VM up in Azure. So there, I created this virtual network beforehand when I set up my environment. The VA VNet failover is 0.1. Okay, click OK. And now what's happening is the VM is starting to spin up in Azure. Okay, and I already have a VHD, a virtual hard drive of my Web01 server in Azure that was stored up there, which is continuously being replicated in real time. So that VHD is going to attach to my VM once it's created, which takes about 10 minutes. So while that is doing its thing, while that VM is spinning up, I want to walk you through some of the steps of setting this up just to show you how easy it is. So we're going to let that run. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to the screen we were at. One thing I wanted to show you is you saw the option that I chose, which is Test Failover. You could also select Failover. So if you were in an actual disaster and you wanted to go ahead and spin up your production environment in the cloud, you would select Failover. That would maintain the same host name. And if you set it up to have the same IP address, it would maintain the same IP. It depends on how you configure it. Now, when you do a test failover, it'll append a -test to the host name so that there's no conflict, and it'll use a separate IP address. And it won't come with a public IP address for you to access yet. You'll have to attach that at a later time. So those are some of the differences between test failover and failover. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other options within Azure Site Recovery while that's going. If you go down here to Manage, you can see Recovery Plans. This is where you'd set up a plan if you had a multi-tiered application. So if you wanted your service to boot in a specific order, if they're a part of one app, you would set that here. You can also set up the automation of the creation of a load balancer, right? If you needed to do that, or any kind of custom settings for a complex application you would set up in a recovery plan. And let me show you what it's like to actually set up an Azure Site Recovery environment. So here, to get started, let's say you're starting from scratch and you just created your recovery services vault. You would just go here under Getting Started. You would click Site Recovery. And the first step here is if you're protecting your on-premises machines, which most of the time you will be, you would click on Prepare Infrastructure. And protection goal. So here, step by step, it's like a pretty simple wizard. You just select the, what applies to your environment, right? So protection goal, where are your machines located? They're located on-prem. Again, you can do Azure to Azure failover, but that's only in preview. It's nothing we have, it's not generally available yet. Where do you want to replicate your on-prem machines to? To Azure. You do have the option to replicate to a recovery site if you have a secondary site, but most folks want to leverage, the power of the cloud and everything you get, the resiliency with Azure. So they select to Azure. And then are your machines virtualized? You would select either Hyper-V, VMware, or not virtualized, which basically means physical. Now, for the sake of this demo, we're doing a physical failover. So I'll just select not virtualized for this. And you'll say OK. Now, when you prepare your source environment, you need to have that config server. We saw it in my diagram earlier that you need to have a config server on-prem that does the orchestration of replicating your VHDs up to Azure. And also, doing the protection of your VMs and making sure that the mobility services and all the underlying components are working so that you can actually fail over up to Azure. So you do need that config server. That's important. If you don't have one set up, you would simply just click plus configuration server. Make sure you have a server 2012 R2 box on-prem. You can get information on the minimum requirements through our documentation. But here, step by step, it tells you all the steps you need to do, like configuring your proxy, downloading the unified setup bits. So you would download that on your configuration server and run it. It's just like a next install. Your Vault registration key here, you would download this onto your config server. That would basically give you access to your recovery services vault. So it allows your recovery services vault in Azure to communicate with your configuration server. And then all these other steps are pretty much just running the installers on the config server. If you're protecting VMware, you'll want to make sure that you have the administrator permissions on your vSphere environment or your ESXi host. Or if you're protecting physical servers, you're going to want to make sure you have admin permissions or a management account that can access those physical servers that you're protecting. That's really important. And once you've done all that, your configuration server will appear here. You would select it and you would say OK. Now you have to prepare your target environment in Azure. You need somewhere to fail over to, right? So you need a storage account. So you could add a storage account to store your VHDs, to store your data that you're replicating up to Azure. And you also have to have a failover network. So you need to have a virtual network up in Azure where your VM can go so that you can actually get to it so it can communicate with other VMs or with the outside world. So this is something you would need to establish before you start doing any kind of failover. So you can see the options here are pretty self-explanatory. Specify your subscription, deployment model. If you're brand new with Azure, just choose Resource Manager. It's a lot easier than the classic portal. And then here, it just lets you know if you have any storage accounts or any networks that are available for use for your failover environment. And you would say, OK. Now here, you could specify your replication policy. So if you click Create and Associate, you would name your policy. Here's where you specify what kind of recovery point objective threshold you want in minutes. By default, it's set to 15 minutes. So you'll have a recovery point of every 15 minutes for up to 24 hours. You can see the retention here is 24 hours. You can change that. You can make that 1 minute. So you can have a snapshot every minute. Of course, that will use up a lot more storage. So keep that in mind when determining your RPO. So I'll just put it back to 15. Your recovery point retention, it's set to 24 here, but it can be anywhere up to 72 hours. So you can only keep your snapshots for up to 3 days. Again, remember, this is a DR tool. Okay, it's not a backup tool. You don't use this to recover files from, say 2 months ago, right? This is to get your mission critical apps up and running in the event of a disaster so that they can run in the cloud. And then for your app consistent snapshots, so you can get your snapshots for like SQL, where you have the data in memory. Here it's set to every 60 minutes. And that's because when you are capturing app consistent snapshots, it is capturing a lot more data. So storage is going to get used up pretty quickly. So you'll want to maybe space these out unless you're planning to have snapshots more frequently. I already have a policy created, so I'm just going to select my ASR policy 01. And then here for deployment planning, there's a tool we have which is called Deployment Planner, which will help you understand if you have sufficient bandwidth or storage provisioned for your environment. So I highly recommend running the Deployment Planner if you're running a VMware environment or physical. But I know in the past it was more for VMware environments. So you can always click on this link to learn more about ASR Deployment Planner. So here I would just say, I will do it later. And then say OK. And that's it. And once you've done that, then your environment is ready for Azure Site Recovery. Very easy to set up. So let's go ahead and check. So that failover is still running. We'll go ahead and pause the recording just so that you don't have to wait till it's done. And when it's back up and running, we'll go ahead and test our failover. Okay, looks like our failover has completed. You can see here we have the green checkbox, which is a good sign. Let's take a look at our virtual machine. So let's go to our resource group where I have our failover environment. Okay, let's see here. So we failed over to our Virginia data center. Right here, I have a resource group. Resource group is basically a logical container where you can store all of your Azure resources based on workload or however you want to organize them, much like an organizational unit in Active Directory. Okay, so you can see in this resource group, here is the VM that got created by Azure Site Recovery, IAWeb01-test. Remember, the original name was IAWeb01. It appended the -test to the end of the name. And first thing we have to do is add a public IP address so that we can actually get to this virtual machine. So we can RDP to it or so we can browse to it since it is a web server. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll click on networking. Let's go to the network interface card attached to this VM. Here's the NIC. You can see it has a private IP address, does not have a public IP address. So we can't get to it over the public internet yet, does not have a public endpoint. So we're going to go to IP configuration here. Let's click on the NIC settings. Let's enable a public IP address. Let's create a new public IP address. We want it to be static. Let's name it IAWeb01-public IP or -pip, PIP. Let's say OK. And now that is creating the public IP. And we'll go ahead and let the public IP get created. So it's been created. Now it's saving that public IP and attaching it to the network card of this VM. So that usually takes about a minute. So I'll go ahead and pause the recording and come back once it's done. Okay, so the public IP address has been added. You can see it here, the 52.227.175.1.168. That is the public IP for our VM, which is in Azure, that web server that we failed over up to Azure. So that's its new public IP. Let's take note of it. Let's see, .175.168. Okay, let's hope the demo gods are nice to me today. And let's copy that public IP address. Let's open up a new browser. Here's my browser session. Okay, let's paste in the public IP. And boom, there we go. So here's my web server, exactly like how it was when it was on premises. So in a matter of minutes, failover took about, I think, about 12 minutes. We were able to take my physical server on premises, which is a web server, fail it over up to Azure, and there it is. It's running in the cloud. So, pretty great disaster recovery tool. It didn't require me to purchase any hardware. It didn't require me to lease out a separate colo facility, and in minutes we were able to get our website or our web server back up and running. It's a great tool. Also, if you want to migrate your VMs up to Azure from on-prem, you can use the same tool to do that. You can also use it for test dev purposes. So if you wanted to test an app up in the cloud, maybe install a patch, you could do a test failover of your app from on-prem up to Azure, and then test that patch or any updates on your Azure instance or your Azure VM. Make sure it works, and then if it works, go ahead and just delete the VM up in the cloud and go ahead and apply the changes on your on-prem environment. So a couple great use cases, but again, this is a great DR tool to leverage the power of the cloud. If you'd like some help, reach out to your Microsoft representatives. Also, if you have any complex deployments, we have some great partners that can really help you. So again, just reach out to us if you have any questions, and let me put up my contact info one more time so that you can reach out to me if you have any questions. So let's do that. And there's my contact information. So feel free to email me at jeffrey.vasquez@microsoft.com. And again, thanks for your time. I appreciate you watching the video, watching our demo, and hopefully you'll start kicking the tires and try out Azure Site Recovery. Thanks everyone for your time, and take care. Bye-bye.